There's a warning with this talk. It's so depressing, most people give up after a while and don't want to hear it. So the talk is on global warming and the environmental degradation associated with the use of fossil fuels. The air concentration of CO2 is now 400 parts per million and rising. 350 parts per million is considered safe. Some of the manifestations of global warming are melting of glaciers, more drought in some areas, more extreme weather events, and sea level rise, which is quite well documented. CO2 emissions are projected to rise into the future, with China dominating, followed by US, OECD, Europe, India, Russia. About 565 gigatons of carbon dioxide is projected to cause about 2 degrees of global warming. There's a massive amount of reserves already known and more being found. They represent about 10 degrees of global warming, and there are $27 trillion of assets on company books. It's virtually impossible to stop this. They're coming down the pipeline. The ICE Intergovernmental Panel models show that by the turn of the century, they project between 2 and 4 degrees of global warming depending on the scenario. So there are potential remedies. Probably the most important is to make the fossil fuel cost more reflective. Polluter must pay, and removal of subsidies. This will make alternative sources more economic. Now, there is environmental degradation associated with extraction of fossil fuels besides and together with global warming, such as we see in the tar sands. They're seeing toxic effects on fish, air pollution, toxins in sediment above the threshold of liver cancer for fish. These are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Scientific papers by Schindler and Kelly and others showing dissolved polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in aquatic environments around the tar sands. Paper by Timoney and Lee documented sources of pollution. And the tailing ponds themselves are the biggest source. They contain toxic PAH, arsenic, cyanide, naphtenic acids, mercury, sulfuric acids. The tailing ponds are just dikes of natural material. They're not lined, so that toxins can seep through into groundwater and the rivers, and as well the dikes could break. These tailing ponds actually are all over the world. The dikes have broken elsewhere, such as in Spain. The reclamation of these ponds is very slow because the sediments take a long time to settle. Suncor has developed a method using polymers to speed this up, but you get a dewatering of toxic water, and according to the Penn Institute, you have to put this water somewhere, and they don't consider that a successful reclamation. There's been a study of the tar sands from the Royal Society of Canada. They produced a report. There are some things that aren't too bad. The impacts on the regional water supply aren't severe, but they're finding environmental monitoring is inadequate and reclamation is not keeping pace with development. There are some potential remedies for the tar sands that would help out, like clay liners, scrubbing of airborne emissions, treatment of the waste, environmental monitoring, etc. These are expensive and require changes to regulations. Elsewhere in the world, there's many documentation of pollution. For instance, in Nigeria, massive documentation of oil spills that's continuing and toxic effects on fish there. Satellite images of death of vegetation over wide areas in the Niger Delta. Many cases of oil spills in pipelines, gas flaring, unattended oil fires, devastation of the countryside in the Niger Delta. In Ecuador, there's tailing ponds that have been leaking for a long time. The people in that area have sued Chevron for $18 billion. Chevron has refused to pay, and they've gone now to 30 countries to try and seize the assets of Chevron, including in Canada. There are some potential remedies, such as worldwide exposure, legal action. Ecocide is a crime punishable at the World Court. I don't know if any of those would come into being. And you're familiar with the Gulf oil spill. That's another area of potential pollution and deep sea drilling. It has already occurred. There's a toxic legacy from the Gulf oil spill. They're seeing eyeless shrimp tumors on fish. Canada's deep sea regulations were actually watered down in 2009, trying to shift the responsibility to the companies for environmental protection. So there are potential remedies: better blowout protection, drilling of secondary or relief wells, more inspection, research and development, etc. Again, these require changes to regulation and are expensive. As conventional sources are depleted, they're turning to sour gas, oil, and gas sources. These contain deadly toxin H2S, hydrogen sulfide. In 2003, you had a blowout in China that killed 234 people, 65,000 evacuated. We have a long history in Alberta and BC of similar type incidents, including 34 workers killed, a big blowout in 82 affected thousands of people, and many others right up till the present time. Similarly, in Michigan, there's a history. In Calgary and other populated areas, there's sour gas wells right inside the city limits. And the H2S in the sour gas, one breath over 500 parts per million will kill instantly. There's a massive network of pipelines in Alberta. Excuse me, about 5% are sour. Here's a picture of some. There's a long history of leakage in Alberta. Over 15 years, 16,000 leaks, and about, that's about 3 a day. There are some potential remedies, including better corrosion protection, isolation valves, stainless steel pipes, double-walled pipes, again requiring changes to regulations and expense. You've heard of hydrofracking. They're turning to that now to recover mostly gas. That's a method by which horizontal drilling is done, and fracking fluids, which are toxic, are pumped under pressure to break up the rock. That can also open existing pathways to the surface, where the fracking fluids and toxic saline groundwater can access the environment, and also through the wells themselves. There's also what they call produced water from this process that has to be disposed of, that is very toxic and can get into the environment. There's many areas in North America that are suitable for hydrofracking, including the Bakken Formation that goes right into southwest Manitoba. In North Dakota already, they're hydrofracking and flaring off excess natural gas, which is wasteful and polluting. In Pittsburgh, this is a picture of fracking fluids, produced water released directly to the river. This is toxic material. It actually goes through a waste treatment plant, a municipal plant, but that's not designed to remove the toxins. There's many areas in the U.S. where water is so polluted you can light it on fire, well water. In 2005, there was a loophole called the Halliburton loophole in the U.S. that was passed that allows companies to keep secret what's in their fluids. And there's a large history of pollution from fracking in the U.S. and Canada, including in Alberta, where Jessica Ernst is suing Encana for multi-million dollars for pollution of her land in Alberta. There are some potential remedies for hydrofracking, trapping of the released natural gas, treatment of the water, imaging using 3D seismic of pathways to the surface, etc. It's important to realize that coal is projected to dominate CO2 emissions into the future, particularly from non-OECD countries which is mainly China. There's environmental degradation associated with coal extraction. In the US, they blow off the top of an entire mountain and you get rubble down into the valleys. This is massive environmental degradation to expose coal seams. They have also coal slurry impoundments that can leach into groundwater, and the dikes can break. In 1972, 120 people were killed from a dike burst of coal sludge. In 2008, 1.1 billion gallons were released in Tennessee from a dike burst. You've heard of clean coal. This is the procedure where they can scrub the CO2 out of the flue gas of a coal-fired plant. Such a plant is being built in Estevan, Saskatchewan. It's all government subsidized. $1.24 billion. It's an extremely expensive process that would not normally be competitive. It's also parasitic. 30% of the energy produced will go into the CO2 recovery, and that CO2 will be pumped into oil fields to recover more oil. This is called enhanced oil recovery. That oil will be burned to produce more CO2. So this, in reality, is a method to get oil out of the ground using the CO2. There's at least 3 subsidized carbon capture initiatives going on in Canada with very big subsidies, $745 million in Alberta and Saskatchewan. In those incidents, the CO2 will be pumped underground. Now in Zama Lake, this is a big sour gas oil field and gas field. These hydrogen sulfide stripped off is called acid gas. It's pumped back into the oil field to recover more oil and left there. It's extremely toxic. It's left in pinnacle reefs that can leak through all the wellbores in the field that have cement seals and steel liners that are not geochemically stable, so they will likely eventually leak. I wrote a paper on this that predicts what will happen after the field is closed. You get leakage for 1,000 years, polluting an area of 600 kilometers around, making it uninhabitable, and you have pockets of lethal hydrogen sulfide. There's nothing unusual about Zama Lake. These fields are all over the world. The normal process now is to use the Claus process to render the H2S to elemental sulfur, and you get big piles of sulfur from it. But the entire world is looking at Zama Lake now because this is a cost-effective, much more cost-effective way of getting rid of the H2S. But it has this toxic legacy associated with it. There are some potential remedies for this, including injecting the CO2 in uneconomic saline reservoirs instead of oil fields, and disposal of the sulfur that you normally get in limestone pits. Overall remedies, thorough environmental assessments by third parties, no cabinet veto like we have in Canada, regulations, funding, and probably the most important, cost of environmentally responsible extraction reflected in the price of fossil fuels. This would make other sources more competitive. And remember, we're trying to get to 350. We've already passed that, so we're past the boundary already. So that's it. I hope I've cheered you all up. Sorry for the throg in my throat. I hope it's not due to hydrocarbons. Yes.
I'd just like to ask there's lots of back and forth that I hear about the environmental impact of hydrofracking and the fact that some of this flammable well water was already flammable before, and people are just trying to glom on to these suits, and some of it's legitimate, some of it's not. How skeptical should we be of these sorts of claims?
Well, I would say that it's sort of a people wouldn't be normally drinking their well water before if it was already flammable. And the other thing you have to realize is that in many areas, it's very difficult to fight this in court. You have to get, these people are left on their own resources, and it's very difficult to document, to get the scientific evidence, and it held up in court for a very long time. This doesn't mean that aren't maybe some people that are trying to scam the process and make things up, but it's very difficult to make that kind of stuff up. It's also very difficult to fight it, even to get the proper evidence to show what's going on. I mean, for instance, Jessica Ernst in Canada is having a heck of a time, and it's quite apparent in most of these areas the regulators are actually against, working against people. She's found out some of the background evidence of what natural hydrocarbons were doing in the past in those wells in Alberta has been removed from databases. And so the question that you asked about what is the natural occurrence of this is very hard to get and sometimes removed from Alberta regulators' databases. So yes, there is some naturally occurring hydrocarbons, but to the extent that you could light your water on fire and the pollution that these people are getting, it's pretty clear. And you can actually get isotopic evidence of where it's coming from. But this evidence, most people are not capable of gathering.
Okay.
And there's a lot of propaganda put forth by the oil companies that say it's safe, and there's a lot of money put into local campaigns in the U.S. and political funding to promote this. There's multi-millions of dollars. It's in one of those slides that I showed that they're spending to lobby their efforts in U.S. and Canada.
I think I remember an oil executive or something drinking some of the fracking fluid or whatever at one point, just to show that it was safe.
Well, I wouldn't want to. But
well, and we don't know what was in it.
We don't know what's in it. They do say that the contaminants are at a very low level, 1% or so on. But you have to realize that benzene itself, the toxicity level is 5 parts per billion. So 1% is way above that. There are many arguments they use to minimize it, but they have found these toxic hydrocarbons in the fracking fluid like benzene and toluene and aromatic hydrocarbons. They also use, in some cases, radioactive tracers, iodine-131, to find out where the fluids are going. And there's more iodine-131 that they're putting in some cases into those fracking fluids than you'd ever get from a nuclear incident. As well, the groundwaters that come up, the saline groundwaters, contain radium and thorium, which is also breeds radioactive daughters. So you can get more radioactive contamination from hydrofracking than you would ever get from any nuclear plant that has ever been built. It's not just hydrocarbon, it's also heavy metals that are in saline groundwaters and radioactive, naturally occurring radioactive elements like radium and thorium.
And from what I understand, the produced water is frequently just sort of left in vats and it can evaporate because they're uncovered.
The produced water, there's many things they do with it. It's a huge volume of water that has to be gotten rid of. Sometimes, like I showed you there, it's sent to municipal treatment plants, which they call approved facilities. Then it's discharged to the river. Municipal treatment plants are designed to take out sewage, not toxins. The other thing they do is sometimes they just spread it out on the land. Most areas they've stopped that. Sometimes they inject it into the ground, but there's different classes of wells. Sometimes it's only shallow injection, it can come back up. And Jessica Ernst actually has a picture of them spraying it onto fields in Alberta, onto fields where cattle graze or crops are growing, just spraying it up in the air. So they do often it seems that what they can get away with, and the regulations are bent, like the Halliburton loophole, for instance, that allows them to actually keep secret what's in the fracking fluids.
What can we do anything about this?
Exactly. What can we do about it? The only thing that I can think of is exposure, such what I'm doing. Most of the time when you talk about it, people think that's terrible, and then ask the same question, what can we do about it? I actually got a friend to produce try and introduce some legislation at the NDP convention, resolutions on this about enhanced oil recovery, and it was voted down. There seems to be very great resistance, both politically and in government and through the regulators, to stop any of this. And so I don't know what you can do. Maybe you have a suggestion.
Well, certainly talking about it and not shutting up about it seems like it would be a step in the right direction anyway.
Yes, although, as you pointed out, there are people who will go up and refute everything I've said, and there's lots of propaganda in the other direction. And even from what I've shown you here, there are ways to do it more safely, but it's expensive, and none of these, if people are in business to make money, they're not going to do something that's expensive unless that takes away from their bottom line.
Right, unless they're forced to.
And unless they're forced to by regulations. And the regulators are essentially, they have a vested interest in keeping this business going, keeping the jobs going with it. And in the US, you get massive political contributions where people are bought off. So it's very difficult, even in the political environment, to pass these type of regulations, because they don't want to affect the jobs. And they don't want to suppress the business. The industry will say, well, we'll go somewhere else. Yes?
So assuming no significant measures are put in place and everything continues exactly as it's going or worse, for average people such as in this room, what would you expect to be the main consequences of these activities in, say, 5, 10, 20, 50 years?
Well, yes, that's a very good question. Because you can see hydrofracking is so extensive, and it's also in major growing areas. You can get massive pollution of groundwater, and you can get this coming into the environment, into the food sources, into the air sources. So in some ways, this will eventually have to be cleaned up. I mean, so there's environmental cost. It always goes down the line, and it's eventually the government that has to pay for it, or else we get sick. One or the other, or it affects our food supply so much, there's so much contaminated, it takes areas out of production. There's always an environmental consequence, and sometimes it just means more cancer deaths, more polluted water that you have to clean up, and it falls upon us to do it. There's a big history of this in the mining industry. In Manitoba right now, there's reclamation going on of many tailings that have been left over there, and it's our government that's paying for it. They go back and remediate these tailings, but once it gets into the groundwater like this and into the environment, it's like trying to get rid of the horses once the barn doors open. You can't bring back the pollution. It spreads. You want, the best way, of course, is to do it at source, or to do it not at all. I mean, why would we build a multi-million-dollar coal-fired plant that ultimately the CO2 trapped goes into the ground to produce more? Why wouldn't, and what's meant $1.24 billion, why wouldn't we just build a windmill? Can you tell me that?
Because windmills don't work as well as a nuclear plant.
Okay, that's another point. Why don't we build nuclear plants?
People are afraid of them.
People are afraid of them, but they don't produce any CO2. And
with windmills, one of the problems is intermittent generation too.
yes, and one of the big problems with windmills is intermittent generation, how to store it, And what you need is a big investment in the grid. People are quite willing to build pipelines, but they won't build copper wires in grids and make them more smart and get them to communicate over big areas. And the other thing with, in Canada, we're blessed. You could actually have a combination of windmills and hydroelectric, because if they communicate over a big enough area, when the wind's blowing, you store water. And, but you need this communication through smarter grids and a big investment in infrastructure. We'd rather build pipelines over vast wilderness areas rather than a copper wire. I mean, which would you rather have going through your land, a copper wire or a big, huge steel pipe full of toxic crude oil?
With recent fight over where to run a power line and to run it an extra 500 miles or not, it's not surprising you see issues like that.
Well, there's always going to be an issue. I mean, any of these power sources. And the other thing is, what are the consequences of not doing anything? Because if you don't produce energy, the whole world standard of living goes down. So sometimes people say, well, we have to stop burning oil and coal and oil and gas. Well, the remedy may be worse than the disease. If you can't produce energy, the whole world's economy and standard of living will go down, but there must be a better way to do it. And the main thing in the oil and gas industry, they're not doing it in a way that is optimally safe. To do so, to make it better, requires a big investment of money. And the impetus is not there to do it. The impetus is there to avoid it as much as possible. Yes.
You're talking about sour gas leaks in Alberta, and actually it was reminding me when I was, I'm going to say 8 years old, there was some kind of leak like that in Alberta, and I was living in Edmonton at the time. I actually spent my 9th birthday in University Hospital in Edmonton with pneumonia, my younger brother and I as well, because it was affecting it was affecting younger people, and elderly were getting sick and being hospitalized because of this gas leak in Alberta. I was just wondering, like, we were talking about nuclear power plants, and everyone can name, 3 Mile Island and
Yes.
Hiroshima not Hiroshima,
Chernobyl.
Chernobyl
Yes.
and Japan. And
Yes.
What do you think, like, of all these potential catastrophes that could be coming down the line from this, which do you think is sort of the most likely to change some public opinion towards, hey, maybe we ought to rethink how we're getting our energy?
Well, yeah, people are totally irrational, because hydrogen sulfide, as you know and have experienced, is more deadly. It kills you. It drops you dead. Bang. You're dead. One breath, you're dead. I mean, nuclear energy, you have to stand beside a reactor for a few hours before you're killed. And you can't even get there. And most of the pollution that they say can come from a reactor is like any other pollution. It can be contained, and it's very dilute, and it takes a long. I mean, there's no comparison in hazard here. And the other thing is, 3 Mile Island. How many people were killed in 3 Mile Island? Zero. How many were killed from the accident in Japan, from the nuclear incident? Can you tell me how many people were killed? Zero. Do you know how many were killed by the tidal wave? And Chernobyl, that was just gross negligence.
Oh, it's hilarious if you read up on it.
Yeah, I mean, the whole I mean,
If you think tragedies are hilarious.
so, now this hydrogen sulfide, though, it's worse than you think, because this thing I put about Zama Lake, this is a time bomb waiting to go off, and it's way worse than anything that could ever come from a nuclear reactor. And this could happen all over the world. They're putting toxic hydrogen sulfide, megatons of it, under the ground in Pinnacle Reefs, and just leaving it there with only cement plugs to stop it. And they can actually get a license to do this. And then they say, well, they got a cement plug there, it's not going to leak. Well, it's not going to leak while they're doing it. And if it did leak, they'd fix it up. But how do you stop a leak after they remove this? Whole entire area is a wetland. It starts spewing out hydrogen sulfide. How do you stop it? You go in there and try and plug it up? Well, you can't even get near it without being killed. You have to go in with breathing apparatus. And there's nothing unique about Zama Lake. There's pinnacle reefs all over Canada, all over the US, all over the Middle East that are stripping out hydrogen sulfide right now, producing those piles of sulfur, using the Claus process. And they're looking at Canada and saying, well, we don't have to do this in Canada. If they're not doing it in Canada, they're collecting the hydrogen sulfide and shooting it back underground. Why can't we do that? Canada's a responsible country, aren't we? We would never allow people to shoot toxins under the ground that could come up and essentially kill people over a 600 kilometers for 1,000 years. How's that sound to you? How's that sound compared to disposal of nuclear waste in copper containers underground that can't possibly leak anywhere? I mean, the people they don't make rational judgments. They'll allow this to happen with hydrogen sulfide and get completely distorted about a nuclear plant. But they're quite happy to build this CO2 monstrosity in Estevan with our money, $1.24 billion of our money, to strip out CO2 to be used to recover more oil.